Till the very end. It was a really big, long day. I also want to formally thank Lissa and Roz for putting on such an extraordinary conference. Al and I are going to bring it back very specifically to the question of genocide, but we are going to be referencing papers and statements that were made all day that we've been dying to weigh in on, given our new work together, where we are shifting the theoretical paradigm for how we even understand genocide from some sort of event, which we think has never adequately characterized any genocide ever, to a pathology of socio-political economic practices that undermine the social vitality of very specific communities. To get back to something that Al said last night, right after the opening talk, I really don't want to forget that genocide is a legal category and yet signifies violence that exceeds legality. So in our imaginary, genocide is a critical word in our imaginary. It actually represents the very worst crime that can be done, for which there is no possible justification because it is an attack on a people or community as such, right? And it's that as such which lends the notion of genocide as the very worst crime. It's really clear, it's important for Al and I to emphasize that genocide is not a tragedy, which means it is not inevitable, it is not natural, right? If you think about death as a tragedy or a broken heart as a tragedy, genocide is not random or spontaneous. It is an organized effort to destroy an entire population marked by race, class, gender, religion, or ability. So in this sense, genocide is also not exceptional, but instead realized through everyday practices that seek, again, to undermine the social vitality of an entire community. So the reason judgment that we have all developed over the course of this entire day, that we all have right now, the reason judgment that we can, in fact, understand state-sanctioned violence against Black and brown bodies in the United States as genocide, we all have that reason judgment, does not stand up against the collective belief that it is not genocide. And that's what Roz is really upset about, right? No matter how many fantastic analyses we do to show that obviously, right, even using the UN Convention's definition of genocide, and as underground rappers have literally been saying for over 30 years, it is very clear that the United States was founded on genocide and has perpetuated genocide against Black and brown bodies through different kinds of policies. Because that reasoned judgment is rejected by a more general belief about genocide in our imaginary, we need to actually start our work with how we imagine genocide, and how that the way that we have imagined genocide in the popular and political imaginary has been constructed in a very specific way to exclude American racism. You want to say a few words in opening now, too?
Yeah, so I'll say a bit about my approach. I think that was, Dr. Skitolsky was framing the approach that we're taking. Again, thank everyone for hanging out with us and allowing philosophers to go at the end, right? I don't know if you know what you got yourself into at this late hour. I think one of the things that we're interested in doing here is to not necessarily add to the economy of information, but philosophers tend to ask questions, and so everything that we're saying here is to drag out a more specific set of questions that can be posed against how we think about genocide, how we think about Black lives and anti-Black violence. My area is in aesthetics, and particularly in what we might call something like critical aesthetics. And I think that what's problematic is how the aesthetic has been left out. So in general, we might talk about aesthetics as being concerned with questions of beauty, questions of art, et cetera. But that's not exactly what I'm concerned with. I'm concerned with how something appears and how something fails to appear. How is it that something is made to appear? What are the conditions under which something is made to appear and allowed to appear? And what are the conditions under which something is made to disappear? That's what I mean by critical aesthetics, and that's really the sort of methodological underpinning of this, is that there's a question about not just what appears, but what's made to appear. There's a question about what's not just what is left out, but what's made to be left out. And I'm particularly interested in the way in which things, some things become produced as moments of making something appear, and yet they actually are they're at the same time that they're making something appear, they're also producing a type of disappearance. For example, right? For example, the narrative that would suggest that the history of anti-black violence in the United States is one monolithic thing that you can trace from slavery to Jim Crow to the civil rights, and then popcorn, right? There is a sense that, right, that history is a continuous history of always getting better. Well, as philosophers, we have to say something like, possibly, but I disagree. The violence, because what gets left out of that nice, neat narrative? The violence of slavery produces the African American, produces the black experience in one mode as slave, but that's not the same as the violence of Jim Crow. That's not the same as the violence of post-civil rights. And we have to acknowledge that, right, as we come up against some similar things, as we come up against residual violence, that whose benefit is it to reproduce this narrative that tells a nice, neat history of progress, when what we're confronted with is the return to that same traumatic violence, and yet it claims us in very different ways. So our attention to the aesthetic here is not to trivialize or to take a luxurious journey through questions that don't frame exactly what we allow ourselves to ask and what we allow ourselves to challenge. So I would just say, turn that back over to.
Right, and our focus as philosophers is on how discourse, which a lot of other people have referenced today, discourse does not represent the world. Discourse shapes our worlds. So if we want to change our world, we need to be really critical about the discourse we use to describe and talk about violence. And the main thesis of Al's very recent book, which I'll be mentioning, is that the way that we discursively talk about anti-black racism and violence, the way we talk about the history of civil rights, and the way we memorialize past moments or racist practices actually becomes part of what perpetuates genocide in the United States. So there's not a little at stake, there's everything at stake in examining the discourse we use to talk about racism and violence. When the Civil Rights Congress, and this has been mentioned for 2 days, when the Civil Rights Congress presented their petition against the United States to the United Nations in 1951, they became the first group ever to attempt to file a legal charge of genocide after the adoption of the UN Convention Against Genocide in 1948. So this happened. So while someone needs to bring this to the UN, this happened in 1951. The very first group ever that made use of the brand new United Nations Convention used it to try to sue the United States for being guilty of genocide against African Americans. Members of the Civil Rights Congress presented the petition called "We Charge Genocide, the Crime of Government Against the Negro People" in UN offices in New York and Paris. Their petition was completely ignored. This is an example of what philosophers now refer to as an epistemic injustice, or the refusal to grant certain testimonies and or perspectives any epistemic value whatsoever. Further, Raphael Lemkin, who coined the term genocide and lobbied for the UN Convention, wrote a scathing rejection of this petition put forward by the Civil Rights Congress in an op-ed in the New York Times that did not at all refer to the central argument in the text itself. There has been no substantial concern with this document presented by the Civil Rights Congress or Lemkin's response to this document in the field of Holocaust and genocide studies. We Charge Genocide as a document, in my view, has just been dismissed to the ashes of history. So we want to return to this lapse in reasoning, not only as an instance of injustice, but is situating a context through which anti-Black practices have been identified as genocide, and yet, because this genocide is situated within the cultural norms of society that already exist, it disappears as an event. We are concerned with the inability of the UN to hear the petition or respond to the petition at the time of its presentation, and with Lemkin's refusal to consider the content of the petition. We are also concerned with the scholarly indifference to this petition, which excludes it from philosophical and historical consideration in the field of genocide studies. In what way has the field of genocide studies itself been shaped by this refusal to think about systemic anti-Black racism as a system of genocide? What assumptions have made this refusal seem obvious and reasonable? We will identify and challenge one assumption that precludes an interest in the genocidal character of anti-Black racism by problematizing the ontology of genocide as an event of extreme violence against a targeted population, an event that is always marked, apparently, by a discrete and obvious beginning and end to the violence against the population. Construing genocide in terms of an extreme event of mass violence against a targeted population is consistent with the politics of memorialization that rests on a liberatory or teleological view of history and the history of social justice movements. In his new book, The Post-Racial Limits of Memorialization, Frankowski argues that the politics of the public memorialization of anti-Black violence in the United States reinforce the post-racial discourse, right? Like we're over racism, that represents this violence as a product of the past overcome in the present. Dr. Frankowski recommends a new politics of mourning, collective political mourning, as counter-resistance to the moral and historical blindness induced by the politics of memorialization and its optimistic representation of our progression toward freedom and social equality of all historically oppressed groups. For the act of public mourning interrupts or disrupts the liberatory reading of social justice movements to better bear witness to the repetition of racist oppression and systemic violence in the present. In his text, Frankowski connects the teleological view of human suffering, that we suffer less over time, with the perpetual production of unlivable life in the present, always already disavowed as a tragic exception to the norm of a better, less racist society. So that's the problem, is regarding every police murder of a young Black man as an exception to an otherwise just justice system. That's why we need genocide, right? These aren't tragic exceptions to a better norm. And the notion of genocide as pathology can help us better see that and recognize useless systemic violence as useless systemic violence.
And can I add just a little bit to that? I think one of the interesting things to consider is that in our discourse, right, the first things that when we see something like the killing of Freddie Gray, one of the first things that we do is we post-racialize it. We post-racialize it by saying, this is horrible, but at least it's not as bad. It's not as bad as things used to be. And at that moment, we've post-racialized it. And I want us to sort of think about that move, that gesture, to take something that's very present and push it into the past suddenly as a type of cannibalism. I think that it has that same sort of feature of weaving together or sort of masking over a disgusting practice in the present and trying to make it seem like it suddenly becomes naturalized. And notice that when Trayvon Martin's killer was acquitted, what did Obama do? The first move was to say, we must acknowledge that we have come a long way as a country, and he post-racialized the moment suddenly. He post-racialized it in such a way that anything that came after is already seen within this long trajectory of history. Yet, it is exactly the same violence, right? It is exactly the same practice as before.
And that's why the focus on aesthetics is so important here. Frankowski's association between the aesthetic representation of state violence, both in the media and through memorialization, and the continuity of that violence is supported by the Cassandra Complex, which he talks about in his book, which we can understand as a network of relations and systematic modes of denial. Such collective practices and modes of denial induce historical forgetting and moral blindness to the extremity of the present that emerges from and survive the extreme violence of the past. The complex is based on the tragic Greek figure of Cassandra, who offered true prophecies that no one could believe, and so suffered from the violence she predicted. The aesthetic distortion of state violence in the past and our post-racial representation of state violence in the present preclude their comparative analysis as symptoms of the same pathological logic that has always informed the practices, institutions, and legal implementation of anti-Black racism in the United States. Our inability to think about the past history of anti-Black racism in terms of how it is operative in the present also serves to reinforce post-racial discourse and perpetuate our Cassandra complex. Do you want to say something else? Or?
I'll say something
Okay.
later about Cassandra. Cassandra will come back.
Yeah, Cassandra's coming back. In order to complement a new aesthetics of state violence that resists the representation of racist oppression as a problem of the past that has been overcome in the present, we offer a new way to conceive of the ontology of genocide as pathology rather than event. Drawing on the Cassandra complex, we can assert that a repetition of practices over time is a system, and a repetition that conceals a dysfunction is a pathology. So I can repeat that. We can assert that a repetition of practices over time is a system, and a repetition that conceals a dysfunction is a pathology. I'm literally just thinking of the justice system. If you think about the complex of practices that have always been operative in the justice system that gets called justice, right? So it conceals the dysfunction in the very process of the system, right? That is really based on the production of unlivable lives and a distortion of human life. So in this way, we can conceive of genocide as a pattern of social, political, economic, aesthetic, and legal practices that produce and sustain lethal dysfunctions in human behavior, such that entire populations are targeted for state-sanctioned violence on the basis of race, religion, ethnicity, gender, ability, and/or nationality. Genocide is a pathological pattern of socio-political practices that have always informed the racist distribution of power and capital in the United States. In this way, the Cassandra complex does not simply designate a pathology of psychology, but instead a pathology of history, by which patterns of violence are repeated but represented such that we do not recognize their continuity and continuous transformation in social and political institutions and interpersonal relations. Thus, our refusal to hear the claims made in We Charge Genocide is both a symptom of this pathology and, to the extent that we refuse to hear its prophecy, serves to reinforce the pathological repetition of genocidal practices against Black Americans. One example that actually has been mentioned today is the fact that obviously slavery isn't over in the United States. It's very alive and well in all of our prisons. I don't know why we don't call it slave labor anymore, but we don't. But I teach at and visit a women's prison near me, and I was there once for a TED Talk where they had some of the women who are incarcerated tell their stories or perform. And I was sitting next to a woman, a white woman, and she asked what I was doing there. I told her, she said, I care about the women here too. I own a corporation. We employ the women to make uniforms. And I said, oh, so you're supporting slave labor? And she said, it's not slave labor. And I said, it's not minimum wage. She said, well, I would like for it to be. That would be great if it was, but I'm not supporting slave labor. I'm like, no, this is slavery. Like, you are benefiting from slave labor, right? And she couldn't hear the words I was saying, right? So this is exactly what I'm trying to get at. Like, yo, there wasn't an event of slavery and then it's over, right? Like slavery is one among a complex of pathological practices that have always been present and informed American society and create extremely dysfunctional interpersonal relationships for all of us. Did you want to say something too?
No. Go ahead.
One concern I have is that everybody likes to talk about this document, We Charge Genocide. Very few people read it, and very few people actually acknowledge its brilliance and the brilliance of its analysis. So one thing I was going to do was read some passages from it, just show you that the analysis you all wish was already there has already been done, right? And it's shocking to the extent to which it's been ignored. So I want to read a little bit about it, and also very few people know how Raphael Lemkin, who is kind of a hero in genocide studies, had the most obnoxious racist disavowal of We Charge Genocide in the New York Times. So I was going to read a little bit about that. My concern is that that sort of historical background, which I think is really important, especially for this particular conference. But I don't want to take up too much time because Al's contribution is the really meaty theoretical work, right? Talking more about the Cassandra Complex and sort of the wrong way of acknowledging violence creates a seeds for repetition of that violence. So I'll say a little bit of this, but maybe I'll cut myself short. Or you can interrupt or something like that, okay? So this is one of the most powerful passages, and it's from the introduction to We Charge Genocide, which again was written in 1951. I really can't say that enough. Out of the inhuman black ghettos of American cities, out of the cotton plantations of the South, comes this record of mass slayings on the basis of race, of lives deliberately warped and distorted by the willful creation of conditions making for premature death, poverty, and disease. It is a record that calls aloud for condemnation, for an end to these terrible injustices that constitute a daily and ever-increasing violation of the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. I hear so much underground rap as just a continuing effort to put forward the mission set forward by We Charge Genocide. I mean, as I've been sitting here, like all these lyrics have come back to me, but that entire passage is actually present in a song by Brand Nubian called Claiming I'm a Criminal. And he's just it's an amazing song, right? And he's just really succinct. He's like, it's the whole black race that they're fucking with. Like straight up, right? He describes the extra legal conditions of getting arrested, the humiliation, the conditions of confinement, which are brutality and torture. Straight up, it's the whole black race that they're fucking with, right? And underground rappers have not hesitated to use the word genocide. So I see underground rap as continuing the project set by the Civil Rights Congress. Although the petition references the continuity of genocidal violence against Black Americans from slavery to the present, it focuses its analyses on the legal discrimination and genocidal violence perpetuated through the then operative Jim Crow laws and mass lynching. And yet the descriptions offered of the methodical state violence perpetrated through legal segregation is also eerily descriptive of the violence now perpetrated through the U.S. epidemic of police murders of unarmed African Americans and their mass incarceration. The following passages could just as easily describe the racist logic of our criminal justice system as the logic of Jim Crow laws and lynching. Quote, "The genocide of which we complain is as much a fact as gravity. The whole world knows of it. The proof is in every day's newspapers, in everyone's sight and hearing in these United States. Its very familiarity disguises its horror. It is a crime so embedded in law, so explained away by specious rationale, so hidden by talk of liberty, that even the conscience of the tender-minded is sometimes dulled. Yet the conscience of mankind cannot be beguiled from its duty by the pious phrases and the deadly legal euphemisms with which its perpetrators seek to transform their guilt into high moral purpose." Right? So law and order is a euphemism for let's arrest, attack, and kill Black bodies. I think the phrase, the criminal justice system, is nothing but a euphemism. The conveners of this petition risked arrest after their presentation to the United Nations offices in New York. And the United States revoked the passport of William Patterson after he presented this petition to the United Nations Assembly in Paris. the authors of the document demand recognition of the distinctly genocidal violence perpetrated by the Jim Crow laws because the term has political power and legal implications. So like, we can't say let's ditch the word genocide when you can see what a threat it was to the United States. Like that means something, that the United States was threatened by the Civil Rights Congress. The use of the term genocide was necessary for this group to oppose the pious phrases and deadly legal euphemisms that had masked the regularity and brutality of state-sanctioned violence against African Americans. For this same reason, Claudia Card appealed to the definition of genocide in order to explain and condemn the harm of social death that emerged from the structural discrimination against entire populations in war and in peace, in the legal and medical and academic and domestic areas of human life. To support their case to the United Nations that the United States was guilty of committing genocide against Black Americans, the Civil Rights Congress cited the then current conditions of legal discrimination, lynching, disenfranchisement, police brutality, and systemic inequalities in health and the quality of life between white and Black Americans. They quite correctly cited Article 2 of the convention to argue that the United States had consistently committed genocide against Black Americans in the sense of 2A, killing members of the group, 2B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, and 2C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. And again, we see all three conditions present every single day in the everyday conditions of confinement in U.S. prisons. The petition includes hundreds of descriptions of then recent cases in which innocent Black Americans, including children, had been murdered by police brutality, lynchings, and the courts sentenced to death. It also provides poignant descriptions of the mental harms suffered by African American communities from legal discrimination and their exclusion from both moral consideration and the protection of the law. So this bold and historic action taken by the Civil Rights Congress was described in only 2 short paragraphs in the New York Times on December 18th, 1951, under the headline. Just really think about the headline and the way we aesthetically represent things. U.S. accused in UN of Negro genocide. And it was 2 paragraphs covering this historic move. U.S. accused in UN of Negro genocide. These 2 paragraphs, where just describe what happened, are followed by 3 paragraphs that cover the reaction of Raphael Lemkin to their petition. Lemkin was the Polish Jewish lawyer who coined the term genocide and convinced the UN to designate genocide as a violation of international law. The article states that Lemkin assailed the petition and, quote, said the accusations were a maneuver to divert attention from the crimes of genocide committed against Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanian, Poles, and other Soviet subjugated peoples. Lemkin was offended that Black Americans would make use of the new Genocide Convention to draw attention to their plight and understand their discrimination on par with the Nazi genocide. Actually sounds like Holocaust and genocide studies as a field in general. Or it really does. It's a repetition. Yeah, it is a complete repetition. Or indeed with Soviet violence against Eastern European populations. I mean, that's like every Holocaust conference is like, how dare you try to understand violence against Black Americans as on par with what the Nazis, how dare you do that, right? But in Lemkin, this is so puzzling because, as Lissa pointed out, like very well this morning, his work had consistently provided a very expansive notion of genocide that did not reduce it to mass murder, but instead recognized multiple ways to destroy entire populations in whole or in part. 2 years after the petition was presented, 2 years after, Lemkin couldn't let it go, he then wrote an op-ed to the New York Times 2 years afterwards. Here is his title of his op-ed: Nature of Genocide, Confusion with Discrimination Against Individuals Seen. Confusion with discrimination against individuals seen. See, that's why you have to keep saying it's the whole Black race that they're fucking with. Do you see what I'm saying? We're not talking about individuals. Although he never mentions the Civil Rights Congress, he directs his remarks against the opponents of the Genocide Convention. So he calls the Civil Rights Congress the opponents of the Genocide Convention, or those who appeal to it in order to name the system of racial oppression in the United States. In Lemkin's title, he denies the substance of the charges in We Charge Genocide, for he denies that discrimination against individual Black Americans, despite the continuous history of slavery and police brutality and lynchings, could ever be interpreted as genocide. Instead, he so callously dismisses the right to compare racist discrimination with genocidal violence, even though clearly in Nazi Germany, you cannot just separate racist discrimination from genocidal violence. That's what he does in his op-ed. And he dismisses the mental anguish suffered from widespread poverty, lynchings, and police brutality as nothing more than being frightened. And this is his exact quote, Raphael Lemkin. The opponents of the Genocide Convention have been asking, literally, can one be guilty of genocide when one frightens a Negro? Yeah, and no one's read this, and no one in our field ever talks about this. We still lionize Lemkin as the most important person ever. Do you want me to repeat it? It's like so offensive. You do, right? It's like unreal that he wrote this. The opponents of the Genocide Convention have been asking, literally, can one be guilty of genocide when one frightens a Negro? Obviously not, because fear alone cannot be considered as serious mental harm, as meant by the authors of the convention. The act is not directed against the Negro population of the country, and by no stretch of imagination can one discover in the United States an intent or plan to exterminate the Negro population, which is increasing in conditions of evident prosperity and progress. In their petition to the United States, the Civil Rights Congress repeatedly emphasized that the American genocide against Black Americans had always been motivated by the desire for capital and power, as has every genocide in the history of nations. So part of the epistemic injustice of separating slavery and genocide is due to bad history in Holocaust studies, which previously had claimed the Holocaust is somehow different because here the Jews were being destroyed just because they were Jews, and there was no overriding instrumental desire, right, for capital or power. That older view has been completely destroyed by a newer generation of more Marxist-minded scholars, historical scholars, who understand that, of course, capital and power were part of the intent, but there is no pure intent to ever destroy people. It's always a desire for capital and power. But my point is that even before the new sexy historians have been doing this in Holocaust studies, Civil Rights Congress said it in 1951. They said very clearly in the document, all genocide is motivated in part by a desire for capital and power. And Lemkin's like, what reason could America have? I can't imagine a reason why America would want to destroy the Negro. Okay. Yet Lemkin claims that by no stretch of imagination could one possibly discover any intent in the regular state-sanctioned murder and exploitation of Black Americans and this legal system of discrimination that served to preserve and still serves to preserve the status quo of white economic supremacy. Lemkin's willfully naive perspective suggests that his inability to see and imagine Black Americans as victims of genocide has more to do with his own racist dismissal of their plight than with any rational assessment of the extensive petition presented by the Civil Rights Congress. For he dismisses the very real terror under which Black Americans live by presenting it as a problem affecting certain nervous individuals rather than an existential threat that emerges from their extreme everyday vulnerability to state-sanctioned violence and death. I think I'm going to pause. So you want to say some stuff now?
Yeah, actually, can we go back to Lemkin's first sentence again?
Yes. Oh, you want me to reread it?
Yeah.
Or you got it. You want me to reread it?
Reread just the first sentence.
Just the first sentence. Okay. The opponents of the Genocide Convention have been asking, literally, can one be guilty of genocide when one frightens a Negro?
Okay, so I want to take off from there and think about and have us just think about what's going on at the level of representation. A representation cannot, right? Cannot simply be, is not just a benign sort of thing. It's not just a record of what appears, but what's made to appear. And here, I think, is a pretty clear record of how Black violence, anti-Black violence in the United States has always had to pass a certain threshold before it even gets to the level of representation. So one of my other obsessions is Immanuel Kant. love-hate sort of obsession. And one of the good things about Immanuel Kant was that he says that a representation is not just about what hits your senses, right? It's an act of consciousness. So it's an activity by which I pull together what I am sensing and represent it to myself, right? And so socially, representations have a very peculiar place because they are not simply records of what's there, but they are constructions and in many ways values that are put into the domain of appearance. So what Lemkin is representing to himself, or what this form of this formal relationship is representing as fear, could be is a gross distortion of the situation, yes. But let's look at what is being represented as in this distortion. In 1934, Claude Neal was described in several newspapers as being his lynching was described in several newspapers. The publication was so popular that it was then reprinted and sent around the country. Here's an excerpt of that account. First, they cut off his penis. He was made to eat it. Then they cut off his testicles and made him eat them and say he liked it. Then they sliced his sides and stomach with knives, and every now and then someone would cut off a finger or a toe. Red-hot irons were used on the nigger to burn him from top to bottom. From time to time, during the torture, a rope would be tied around Neal's neck, and he would be pulled over a limb and held there until he was almost choked to death, when he would be let down and the torture begun all over again. Neal's body was tied to the rear of an automobile and dragged over the highway to the Kennedy home. Here, a mob estimated to number somewhere between 3,000 and 7,000 people from 11 southern states was excitedly waiting his arrival. A woman came out of the Kennedy house and drove a butcher knife into his heart. Then the crowd came by, and some kicked him, and some drove their cars over him. What remained of the body was brought by the mob to Mariana, where it is now hanging from a tree on the northeast corner of the courthouse. Photographers say that they will soon have pictures of the body for sale at 15 cents each. Fingers and toes from Neal's body are freely exhibited on street corners here. The story became a representative of the extraordinary violence at the national level, but Neal's case was not distinctly extraordinary, nor was it extraordinarily remarkable. Between 1877 and 1950, the Equal Justice Initiative has reported that nearly 3,959 lynchings happened. This is more than what was estimated before that report came out. But those, I just want us to remember that those are recorded lynchings that were recorded as lynchings, and that were successful. And so, the thing that we have to think about when we think about the representation of lynching is, yes, there is an extraordinary violence, but at what point does the violence become something that outstrips our imagination? And the term itself, lynching, is something that indicates an extra-juridical violence that exceeds the continuum of murder. It exceeds the continuum of violence and harassment. That's what that Lemkin described as a type of fear. And it's also, when we think about the history of lynching, we often will represent it as various events that have beginnings and ends, but not in its excessiveness. Lynchings were a formal ritual. And the script that Neil's lynching followed is a pretty normal one, of the genitalia being cut off. We can see this again in the documentary of the untold story of Emmett Till. The genitalia being cut off and put into the mouth, the multiple sites of death, and particularly the publicality of the specter of black torture. Mm-hmm. These are the formal elements, and they exceed the actual event itself, and remain with the culture long afterwards. And there's a necessity, that ending part, right? The ending part is necessary, that there's a necessary distribution of the body. There's a necessary distribution of the torture. There's a necessary reproduction of the image over and over again, not to traumatize or even address anything that Neil could have done, but to traumatize, as Dr. Skitolsky has pointed out, right? To traumatize the whole entire black race. Do you want to say more about events?
Oh, first I do, but first I want to say that Al also brought my attention to contemporary forms or transmissions of lynching. Like, this is also not a thing of the past. You should think, and this is all Al brought this to my attention. Whenever a police officer does murder a young black man, it then gets, right now it gets recorded. That's how it makes news. And it's called like a GIF or something. You see it. Is that what it's called, a GIF? I'm 43. That's what, come on, that's what it's called, right? A GIF. Well, you have to think about what's being done here when the GIF of a black man being shot is being circulated, seen and re-seen all over again, right? Here we can see that lynching isn't over. It's like a contemporary manifestation of it. I'm not taking credit for that. That was Al's. But
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things I think to consider, like if lynching has this sort of formal aspect of it, right? It's got to be public. It's got to be redistributed. What have we done away with? We've done away with the necessity of being present to the killing. And when we repost, whether or not we are reposting to increase social consciousness, or whether we're reposting out of some sick fetish, right? The repost itself puts us in the same formal relationship as the practice of lynching. And so what I want to encourage us to think about is not to focus so much on the gratuitous violence that is represented, that detaches our sensibility from it, right? A lot of times in our political imaginary, we think about lynchings as happening in the middle of the night by a few bad apples that have gotten too drunk at the gas station and have nothing to do. And that's not true. It's not true that most lynchings happen that way. Most lynchings happen in public. They were planned a week or so in advance. There was a picnic and carnivalesque-like atmosphere. Children were brought. Music was played. Cotton candy distributed, right? And so there's a way that the publicality of it is necessary. Well, we don't have those festivals anymore in that particular way. But in social space, when we repost something, are we participating in the practice of lynching without the actual interaction, without it? So its aesthetics has shifted, yet our formal relationship remains the same. It means that we have to draw a lot more of questions about our practices, I think.
Yeah, and I guess the last thing that Al has made me realize about lynching is that we think about it so little, and we reconcile it as an event that's over, that we don't think about how creepy that psychosexual investment is in watching black bodies tortured. Like, where did that go? It didn't go anywhere. It's not like over, right? So the psychosexual investment in watching black bodies suffer is now in prisons, right? So I don't know how to explain the excessive, unnecessary, gratuitous amount of violence inflicted on our prisoner population outside of that sort of psychosexual investment in watching black bodies suffer but transferred to the prison. And this is, again, what we mean. Like, the event here is hiding and making us forget more than recognize or reckon with. So it is our view, Al and I's, that the representation of genocide as an event with a discrete beginning, middle, and end also serves as an epistemic injustice, an injustice on the level of knowledge that prevents the recognition of systemic oppression against a marginalized population as genocidal, and so also serves to normalize the infliction of gratuitous violence and social death on targeted populations as mere discrimination that lacks the terror of a real genocide. The ontology of the event as an extraordinary phenomenon that is collectively recognized as such will always fail to represent or detect the genocidal logics that are operative in the everyday practices that perpetuate and normalize state-sanctioned violence against Black and brown bodies. It was really wild for me when I started visiting prison after studying the Holocaust for like 15 years. I was like, but I wasn't saying anything. I haven't heard women say there too. It's just like, how is this America? What the fuck? Does everybody know what's going on in here? And I was like, what the fuck? This is a concentration camp. I had no idea, right? So like people who would describe what you see in the camps and they wouldn't be believed, right? There's just like, it's really unimaginable what happens in the prison system and to reconcile that with American democracy. But of course, there's no reconciliation necessary because America is genocide, right? Okay. So the notions of the singular, the unique, and the unprecedented all presuppose the ontology of the event as the basis for the phenomenon that we call genocide, or the coordinated effort to destroy an entire population. And these notions inform the field of comparative genocide that aims to compare discrete, singular events of genocide that act as ruptures in the political and social order. For this reason, the ontology of genocide as event in this field has perpetuated our moral blindness to the continuity and extremity of anti-Black racism in the United States. So we are going to suggest a shift of paradigm to a pathology to better represent the temporality of genocidal violence and detect the genocidal patterns of anti-Black racism in the United States. We think that if we assume this new paradigm, we can better recognize the genocidal nature of two historically distinct phenomena, lynching and mass incarceration, that do not represent events that begin and end so much as distinct expressions of a continuous pattern of pathological state-sanctioned violence inflicted on African Americans as a group. And so the stakes are so high when you realize what genocide means as a legal category, because once you make the case that the prison system is a system of genocide, there's no reforming that shit, right? You just have to abolish it. You have to raise it to the ground. And it gets so frustrating when people are like, well, what else could we do? You mean we have so much poverty of our moral imagination that we can't think how to pursue justice other than inflicting massive amounts of pain on lawbreakers or suspected lawbreakers, right? It doesn't even matter what comes next. You just have to destroy the system of concentration camps that poses as a criminal justice system in our country. So the question, you can't have an abolitionist movement without the word genocide. Like, it just doesn't work, because then you're always going to get into the neoliberal asking for reform. And this is what frustrates me with Michelle Alexander and the new Jim Crow and that whole take on it, which is that the problem isn't solved by reducing the number of Black men in prison, right? You're still talking about genocidal conditions of confinement. So even if there were less Black men in prison, it would still need to be abolished. It would still be genocide, right? So I don't like how the liberal media is really focused on the word mass incarceration, as if the problem with our system is that there are just too many people in there. No, the problem is that it's a site of torture. It's not just that there are too many people in there, and that's like to forget, right? That's to represent in a way that we forget the perpetuation of genocidal practices in this space, which is then hidden from view.
So to go back to thinking about the eventness, right? The ontology of the event. I want to think with you a bit more about how lynching not as a representation, but as a framework or a form of practice frustrates this quite a bit. As the description of Neil's lynching attests, the history of lynching has been characterized within the discursive practices of the event and ontologized as a past from which no trace has been left. This refers to the aesthetic claims of erasure within our cultural political present. Yet erasure, as in the changing of sign names, is only one type of aesthetic erasure, and it does not get at how the aesthetic sentiments and practices continue despite this erasure, the erasure of the traces. Indeed, the practice of lynching was decidedly not something contained in the event, in the relations between communities, or even in the historical closure of their horizon. Rather, They remain in the way terror texturizes the sensibility toward places and peoples, then and now, and maybe more importantly, in the way that sensibility is cut out, cut off, and seen only within a diasporic horizon that can never be fully recognized as an event of the present. Interestingly enough, right, we say that lynching is not a present phenomenon. So let's do a few I disagrees. So I disagree. I disagree with the way in which lynching is often situated in our language as something comparable to murder. It is not on the continuum of murder, and I think that it's imperative for us to refuse this equation. I disagree. I disagree with the way in which lynching has become something that we somehow know how and what its representation contains. I think we should be a lot more skeptical of when we think when something is categorized immediately not as a repetition of lynching. I disagree with the way in which we think about lynching as an individual or unique thing that only a few bad apples performed here and there. I disagree with all of this. And I think that what we need to see in all of these various ways in which lynching is allowed to appear is something much more pathological at work. Let's go back to this Cassandra Complex. Can we?
I was going to say one more, explain more our pathology, and then go right into Cassandra, because then you'll do that, okay? So I just want to say why this notion of pathology is helpful, right? Why this shift of paradigm, why we like this notion of pathology to describe the nature and process of genocide. We should think of genocide as a pathology or a complex of ways that informs a diseased form of human life. It is through this pathological habit that individuals or collectives attack the basic needs and capacities of entire communities at the same time that all communities suffer from a certain distortion of culture that is contingent upon a particular set of conditions. And when I mean all communities, I mean, when I'm in the prison, I feel really bad for correctional officers. They're like unbelievably fucked up what they have normalized for themselves. So it's not like those who wield the power, right, are in a good position. It's not like they're not also suffering from a seriously pathological way of thinking and acting, right? So by framing genocide as a pathology, we decline to situate the event as either inevitable or as natural, but rather as something difficult to discern and isolate from the larger toxic conditions in our social environment, such as an economic system based on monopoly capitalism, the lack of general access to decent health care, the epidemic of child rape, and systemic state-sanctioned violence against women, immigrants, and people of color. The new field of epigenetics, which I'm now actually getting obsessed with, is also helpful to better understand the continuity of genocidal logics and assaults based on the capacity of our genes to be altered by cultural experiences of trauma, such that the children of traumatized parents are more susceptible to post-traumatic stress disorder, and the children of perpetrators are now thought to be more susceptible to rage and violence against the perceived other. So this new field of epigenetics is actually revealing that the wounds of genocide affect the genetic information passed to succeeding generations. And so overturning the entire history of how we've understood genetics, right? It's not raw material that's delivered to succeeding generations unaffected by what happens in history. Literally, the genetic information that we pass or the dispositions that someone might inherit are affected by what happens in history and in culture. But that means if you think about epigenetics and our notion of pathology, here the model of pathology is both metaphor and a very literal way to understand the continuity of genocidal practices over time that precede and survive any particular event of mass violence. Cassandra.
Okay. So let us refuse to take up the issue of genocidal violence for the purposes of convenience to those who are living. It is far too easy to speak of each event as isolated or as its own pattern, but this puts in place a practice of distortion whereby we forget in what we remember. First, let us think about anti-Black violence as always being excessive. It's excessive to our political imaginary. It is not that we haven't gotten the representations right, but that our political imaginary has been formed in such a way that anti-black violence as actual violence exceeds it. Second, anti-black violence is a practice that maintains a specter of social death, of the rupture of vitality, of the forecast of a complete annihilation. Third, anti-black violence is constantly a practice that is being articulated within a sphere through memory, through rituals, through a type of diversion. And at the same time, it is a sphere of disarticulation. Fourth, knowledge will not get us out of this. Adding to the sphere of knowledge will not disrupt our pathological relationship to anti-black violence. Knowledge can only forecast that at some point we will reconcile ourselves to that past. But again, I don't agree. I want us to take up for a moment the position that we don't agree with the politics implied by reconciliation. The Cassandra Complex. I start working with the figure of Cassandra because what's interesting about Cassandra, and Lissa has also got me to rethink a lot about the Cassandra Complex within the context of genocide, because Cassandra was the prophetess to Apollo, and at the fall of Troy, right, she sees that Troy is going to fall and that she sees her own death. This is like the worst for the Greeks, right, to know that you will die and not be able to do anything about it, right? So she's tortured. But what's curious about Cassandra is that she doesn't really tell people about the future, right? She tells them about the past. So Agamemnon comes and takes Cassandra as his prize. When he shows back up at the house of Atreus, he's greeted by the chorus, and he's greeted by some people, and he's greeted by his wife, Clytemnestra. And she takes him out of his carriage. She sees Cassandra, and the first thing that she says to Cassandra is that she tries to ask her if she understands her, and Cassandra refuses to say anything. She refuses. She remains silent. And Clytemnestra, thinking that she doesn't understand Greek, she says, "Take care of this barbarian. Treat her nicely when she comes into the house." As soon as Clytemnestra's gone, Cassandra addresses the people who are remaining, the chorus, and she says, this house is the house of murder. It smells like an open grave to me. It smells like an open grave to me. Now, what is she referring to? She's referring to right, maybe the future, right, but definitely the Feast of Thyestes, which happens before Agamemnon leaves, where the house of Atreus is cursed by a rival who cooks children in the house, cooks children and feeds them to Atreus, I believe, and so she says this cycle of violence here. The cycle of violence is marked in this house. It smells like an open grave to me. This is the house of horrible things. This is the house of murder. And the chorus responds by saying, we don't know what she's talking about. Now, this is an impossibility. They had to have known what she was talking about. They were structured in such a way that they immediately, when confronted with what was apparent to them, they immediately turned away from it and said, I don't understand this. This is not a representation for me. It's not exactly the same as a denial. And I want us to think about that the language of pathology here isn't exactly the same as a denial. It's a way in which we position ourselves formally to something that is our content, and yet we don't acknowledge it. We don't recognize it. It doesn't get into the circuit of representation. And that's the complex part of it. When Cassandra goes into the house, she is, of course, murdered. But she's told them everything about their violence. If she was in the United States, we could imagine her like Du Bois, looking out from his tower and looking at the American society and the European society, looking at World War I, and saying exactly what Du Bois said at this site. This is not Europe gone mad, but rather, this is Europe. This seeming terrible is the real soul of white culture, back of all culture, stripped invisible today. This is where the world has arrived, these dark and awful depths, and not the shining, inevitable heights of which it is boasted. Therefore, I would like to suggest that using this Cassandra Complex as a way of thinking about how and in what way anti-Black violence is a practice of genocide, reframes the violence as a practice, and is not about denial. It is not a matter of a lack of knowledge. It denotes the practice of violence normalized, without putting its own practices into question. The fact that Cassandra's pathway to justice is silenced means that it has never been tried. The fact that she is the only death never accounted for in the tragedy means that it is still an option. But it is an option, but this option only exists against the restructuring of our socius and the state. If we can learn to see that the Cassandra Complex is not just a way of understanding our pathology, but a way of repositioning our questions and questioning what we take up as normative in the present, then I think that there is a way that we need to, for the first time, again and again, encounter that pathological relationship. Prevention in our context could only mean maintenance, just as reconciliation can only mean a reproduction. The question of mourning that I wanted to pose in my book and that I want to pose to us is a question of reframing our political agency in ways that does not rid itself of the reckoning with the practices of violence any more than it works toward a reinterpretation of what prevention, reconciliation, or recognition may mean. It is, in this sense, it is present for us only in this sense. I'd like to end there.
We're good. Yeah.
Yeah.
We're good. Sorry. Do you want to say more? We're good. I mean, we're good. Of course, Roz.